Well, welcome to this edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, and this week I'm joined by my colleague Jack Britton to talk about what's happening in universities, and not talking about the extent to which students are being locked down or the extent to which it may or may not have been right to allow them to travel around the country at this particular moment, but rather what's been happening to the numbers of students turning up at universities and what might be happening to university finances, and whether the current crisis might change our view about the role of universities going forwards. But Jack, why don't we start just by going through what we know about what's happened to the number of students turning up at university this year? Because I think it's fair to say that with the A-level debacle and uncertainty about what kind of experience students might get, there was quite a lot of uncertainty about whether we'd have an upsurge or a big downsurge in the numbers actually attending.
Hi, Paul. Yeah, absolutely. There was a huge amount of uncertainty, and there was great panic across universities throughout the spring, really worrying about whether they were going to get enough students turning up. And I should say that there's still a lot of uncertainty about this because a lot of the numbers aren't quite finalised yet. But the latest numbers that have been published by UCAS do suggest that things are looking a lot rosier than we thought they might have done, particularly back in the spring, both in terms of domestic student numbers and in terms of international student numbers. So the domestic student numbers seem to be up about 4% since last year, and international student numbers appear to be up about nearly 10% compared to last year. But that, I say, appear to be because these are not quite confirmed places yet. There's still quite a lot of uncertainty around whether people will actually turn up and stay. There's a kind of 2-week cooling off period usually at universities, for example. And also the international student numbers in there are only based on a subset of international students who go through UCAS. So there's actually quite a lot of international students going to university through other ways. But yeah, broadly speaking, things are looking a lot rosier now than perhaps they might have done a few months ago.
And I suppose that's for the domestic undergraduates, that will in part be down to the final outcome of the A-level marking debacle, which saw a big increase in attainment, or at least measured attainment, because all the students got their predicted grades. That presumably means that particularly those universities demanding the highest grades will have seen the biggest increase in numbers?
That's right. The A-level scenario meant that there were lots more people getting the grades that they were predicted, and indeed lots of people doing better than they were predicted, which meant that unusually large numbers of people were achieving their first choice offers at university. That, combined with the government's decision to remove student number caps, meant that the top universities were filling up a lot more of their spots with people who are now hitting their grades. The worry, of course, was then that would mean that all of the lower ranked universities would lose students, but it seems that those universities have been able to dip into the pool of people who were not otherwise going to go to universities. And it seems that, certainly for domestic students, that they haven't experienced massive student number drops, which means that overall the share of people going to university is bigger this year.
That's quite a remarkable change. That comes obviously off the back of many years of increases in numbers going to university. You've got another increase this year when I think we've got actually a relatively smaller cohort, which I think is one of the things that was worrying universities. That presumably means that particularly in those less selective universities, there's going to be quite a lot of young people who have got relatively low academic achievement before going on to university.
I think that's almost certainly true. We don't know for sure what the kind of grade distribution is for the people being admitted, because the data are just so fresh, and we don't, and they don't break things down by that kind of level of detail. But I think that's got to be the case. It's got to be kind of less than usually qualified people going to university on average, which could certainly have implications for whether or not they're going to be able to cope with their degrees. That's particularly true given that they've missed so much education of last year. So as I talked about last time I was on the pod, there was a long period where people should have been revising for their A levels when they just perhaps weren't doing anything. So it's kind of doubly true that people might be less prepared this year for university than they would in normal years.
And what do we know about, you've done lots of work on the returns to going to university, on the value of having a degree. What do we know about the value of a degree to people who go to university whose prior attainment at GCSE and A-level was not terribly good?
Yeah, so we've done some work looking at returns to degrees in the UK. We found that there is quite a lot of variation by where people go and by their prior attainment. So in general, the top universities have higher returns than the lower ranked universities, and it's also the case that that people with lower prior attainment generally have lower returns to university. However, evidence internationally has suggested some other stories, like the returns to students at the margin of going to university or not are actually really high. We didn't really find that in the UK, but evidence from the US has certainly suggested that. So there is possibility that that there are lots of people who, on being drawn into university, would experience very large returns from it. But the evidence from our work isn't quite so positive about that.
And you do know from your work that there are quite a lot of those graduating from universities who go on to earn really not terribly much in the future. And indeed, I think some of your work has suggested that there are, certainly in the first 10 years after graduation, there are reasonable numbers, particularly of male graduates who it appears as if they'd have done better not to have gone to university at all in terms of their earnings, at least.
Yeah, that is true. We've found by the age 30, quite large shares of young men were actually earning less than they would have been projected to earn otherwise. But that really depends a lot on where they're going and what they're doing. A lot of that story was certain subsets of subjects that people were choosing, in particular things like the creative arts, where we see really pretty consistently negative returns across the board for men.
So if what's happened this year is that we've got lots of relatively low academically achieving young men going to less selective universities and studying arts and humanities, they might not end up doing terribly well as a result.
That could be true, yes. Although it doesn't seem that the subject changes as reported from UCAS in student numbers tell much of a story of a shift towards those kind of lower returning subjects. It's quite hard to tease out at the moment, but it doesn't seem like there's a particularly abnormal pattern in subject applications, with the exception of subjects allied to medicine, which is probably people doing nursing, I think. But otherwise, there isn't a really big change in the overall distribution of subject choices, it seems, this year. But yes, broadly speaking, I think the story of lots more people going to university with relatively low prior attainment, it's probably true that their returns are going to be lower. That's true even in absence of adverse labour market effects from COVID itself.
It's interesting what you say about increase in the numbers applying for subjects allied to medicine. That's quite striking given what's been happening recently. I guess that could be either to do with the fact that public sector jobs now look more secure, or to do with a desire to help in a world in which medicine looks much more important.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure what the driver of that increase is. It could be, it could also just be an increase in supply. So there's excess demand in normal times for places on those courses, and I think it's possible that the government's expanded those spaces this year.
I see. Yes, it's and then probably no bad thing given the demands that are likely to be there on the health service going forward. I mean, one of the things that is, of course, terribly striking about the UK in general, in England in particular, is the very high fraction of young people who go on to university, and we're seeing more going this year. I mean, what do we know about in normal times at least, about the choices that they're not making, or perhaps another way of putting it is the lack of choice that is available to young people who don't want to go on to university.
Yeah, I think that's the really stark thing about the UK. So the route into higher education is just so dominant for people staying in education beyond age 18. It seems that almost everybody either leaves or goes to university, and there's only a very small number of people are taking alternative routes through education beyond age 18. We put out a recent piece of work with colleagues at SEVA looking into these alternative routes, and I think the most stark result from that is just the very small numbers of people following those paths. But it does seem that those paths seem to result in relatively good labour market outcomes for the people who are doing them, albeit a very small subset.
So from recollection, I think there are something like, among people who do A-levels or equivalent, there are something like 16 of them will go on to university for every one who goes on to do some other education above A-level standard. I mean, that's remarkable. So 16 for every one who goes on to do, for example, a higher level vocational qualification.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that is a very dramatically different number, and yeah, by comparison with other European countries, for example, that's a very large ratio going to higher education, and there are very obvious questions there about whether our distribution of the paths young people are taking is the right one.
And I suppose one of the worries for young people going through university today then is that there's even more of them going through. There must be risks then for what their earnings are going to be later on. We've already seen, as you said, that there are quite a number who don't earn terribly much even now. Are we taking an even bigger risk with the future in terms of the likely earnings of graduates?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's plausible that the kind of graduate premium, as it's called, would be affected by large increases in the number of graduates, and to an extent, I think that's an important thing to worry about. But it's also worth thinking, what are the outside options to people as it stands? Are they doing something now by going to university that's really inhibiting them, or are they doing something that's actually probably quite a useful endeavour during a time when there's not many alternative things on the table? So yes, maybe it would result in a lower graduate premium on average because more people are going, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not the right thing to be happening this year.
Yeah, that's a crucial point, isn't it? I mean, the options if you don't go to university at the moment are very limited. We know that the number of openings for young people, vacancies, is very, 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 very limited indeed. I mean, one thing that a number of students are clearly thinking about, given the experience they're having at the moment, is questioning whether they should be paying the full £9,250 a year of fees, given that they're not getting the normal student experience. A lot of, or pretty much all lectures are online, and we've seen lots in the news about some of them being locked down in their accommodation. Is this a good moment for rethinking whether we should be charging fees in the way that we do?
Well, I mean, there's a bigger question of should we be charging fees in the way we do, and there's a sort of more relevant current question of is it fair to be charging fees of this size to people when they're not getting the full university experience. I think they're two separate questions. On the second of them, on whether they should be paying these full fees, I think students have got a very reasonable case that they're not getting the experience that they signed up to by getting locked into their student halls and not being able to see any lecturers or hang out with their friends or do any clubs or societies or anything like that, all of which I think is really important. But I would say that fee cuts, while they might sound quite good, they don't actually benefit that many people because of the way the student loan system works. If you were to knock off, say, a couple of £1,000 from the first year fees for everybody, that wouldn't really make a dent into their lifetime student loan repayments. Because people are graduating with such large debts anyway, they don't tend to repay them. So it's only really the people who earn so much that they are able to fully repay their student loans that are the people that are affected by any fee cuts. So while it might cut your headline debt from 50,000 to 47,000 or something like that, it's not actually going to make much of a dent in your lifetime earnings.
Yeah, because most people don't pay back, the large majority don't pay back their full loans. Actually reducing the loans makes almost no difference to those who don't go on to earn significant sums, and helps a little bit those who do earn a lot. I mean, maybe the other thing then to think about is whether students should be being charged quite so much for their accommodation and living costs, which is actually one of the biggest challenges facing a lot of undergraduates. But of course, that's also an important part of universities' income.
That's right. I mean, accommodation accounts for roughly 2% of universities' income, so it's not a hugely important thing. Of course, accommodation rent for students also contributes to lots of other people's incomes, but for universities, it's a relatively small thing. But yeah, I mean, I suppose on one hand, the government should be thinking about helping students with this, but on the other hand, what costs are students facing over and above what they usually face in normal time? I mean, is there a sort of fundamental problem in the amount of maintenance support government is providing for students, or is it something special about this year that means that students are facing higher costs? I'm not sure that the second thing is true.
Yeah, they might not be facing higher costs, but they're certainly getting less benefit from it. But there's a bigger issue, isn't there, for government, that this whole crisis is actually going to result in them, in a rather unplanned way, spending quite a lot more on higher education, isn't it, both up front and in the long run?
Yeah, that's right. So the increase in student numbers is certainly a direct upfront cost to the government, because they now have to pay their tuition fees to the universities, because that's how the student loan system works. If you sign up to go to university, the government then effectively sends your tuition fees to the university, and then you owe the government for that fee. So yes, upfront spending will be up probably about 800 million or so for the 2020 cohort because of increased student numbers. They will, of course, get some of those back, because these students will repay some of those tuition fee loans, but there's still a kind of increased longer run cost from all these extra students going. But there's also the fact that labour markets are going to be worse moving forwards, which is going to seriously dampen student loan repayments, which will be an additional cost to government from funding higher education.
And that's something I think people don't quite take into account, because the sense is that we've got this big loan system that students pay for all of higher education, but the reality is that about half of it is paid in the end by the taxpayer, and that level, and probably proportion as well, will grow as the number of students grows, and as earnings maybe fall relative to where they might have been in the future. But there are also issues, aren't there, for university finances? Whilst the number of students going into university, as we've discussed, if anything, has gone up, there are other things that universities worry about in terms of their incomes and costs at the moment, aren't there?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I think the biggest outstanding issue for universities right now is the state of the pension deficits. So prior to the COVID crisis, pension deficits looked pretty bad, and now they look pretty desperately bad, I think is a kind of basic summary of the situation. So previously there was a deficit of around £8 billion, and that's probably increased by at least £10 billion, maybe even up to £15 billion over the last 6 months. So basically the pension schemes owe more than they're able to pay back, or than they're promising to pay in pensions.
Just one final question. I mean, the Prime Minister has announced today that he wants to make free tuition and training available to people who wouldn't normally or don't go to university, those who have only got GCSE level qualifications, as a way of ensuring that people have something useful to do over this period when they might not be able to get a job. Are universities in any sense in a position to help out on that, or is this something that that they're really not in a position to play a part in?
I mean, in theory, they should be in a position to play a part in it. I think that in a lot of cases they're dealing with their own challenges, and are not necessarily able to be thinking about these kind of issues right now. And I think that these kind of schemes were aimed at FE providers, so further education providers, rather than universities. I think in principle there is scope to bring in the higher education sector into this kind of scheme.
And indeed, maybe it's something that certainly some universities ought to be thinking about harder in terms of their role within the communities that they're set into the longer run. We don't know quite how the education system is going to develop over the next few years, and the extent to which it's going to be affected by what we're seeing at the moment. But the change in the kinds of demand, the change in the sorts of teaching that's happening, the change in the student experience, one might expect to result in some kind of shake-up, actually, in the way that the higher and further education sectors work and work together. But I think we are coming to the end of this episode. I think we've learned an awful lot, actually, over the last few months about what's happening in the university system. There hasn't been the fall in student numbers, or there doesn't appear to have been the fall in student numbers that people were fearing, although that still may come to pass, particularly when it comes to international students. We've clearly had an increase, actually, in domestic undergraduates coming to university, and in particular, those with lower prior academic achievement. That's perhaps not surprising given the lack of alternatives available, particularly at the moment, but we're going to have to be very careful that that doesn't result in a lot of disappointed graduates in a few years' time when they end up finding it difficult to get well-paid work, as indeed some recent cohorts of graduates have found it difficult to do. Even despite all of that and the extra students, universities are by no means out of the woods. Clearly, a lot of students are not having the experience they would have liked and expected. There are clearly challenges about delivering some of the education that they're going there for. And there are also financial problems affecting universities from elsewhere, and in particular, this increase in future pension or in current pension costs to pay future pensions of the higher education workforce. And that's something that we see elsewhere in the funded sector, including actually in local government. So lots to chew on there. Thanks very much to you for that, Jack. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe and rate us. And you can always stay on top of our latest work by visiting www.ifs.org.uk. Stay well, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.